Hello, friends, and welcome to the November 8th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about public policy issues here in the great state of Texas and have a conversation about how you can engage in the process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Engagement Director, and today's episode is brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas and Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas. And today is the second week of our series of Climate-Palooza episodes. Last week, leaders from across the globe began to gather for the United Nations 26th Annual Conference of the Parties in Glasgow to discuss the climate crisis, and we had several faith and climate leaders preview those conversations during the opening days of the conference. Today, we have members of Texas Impact's delegation to COP26 joining us live from Glasgow for the conversation. So with that, I am excited to welcome this distinguished panel to the conversation. First off, we have with us longtime board member and COP alum and climate advocate, Mel Caraway. Mel, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
We also have Texas Impact Foundation Board President Beaman Floyd with us. Beaman, thank you so much for joining us. We have with us former intern, a COP staple, a general friend of the organization, one of my heroes, Ilka Vega, joining us. Ilka, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for inviting me.
And it's good seeing you. And last but not least, we have Texas Impact's Hunger Advocacy Fellow, Isa Peterson, joining us. We really miss her in the office, but Isa, glad that you're enjoying your stay. Glad to have you with us today. And last but not least, we have back with us COP veteran who has been monitoring all these proceedings from lovely Austin, Texas, B. Moorhead, back with us again this week. B, thanks for joining us again.
I'm glad to be here.
All right, so Mel, we're going to start out with you. You were in Madrid in 2019. You've been in Glasgow for the week, and my understanding is this is like your last thing before you head home. So what did you focus on during your time there? Any side meetings, side events, presentations that you were especially looking forward to? How's the week gone?
Well, the things that I was looking at particularly were methane, which has been a very big topic with the U.S. coming out with new guidelines and regulations from the EPA this week. And there have been a number of sessions related to that. There was one whole booth in the pavilion which was dedicated totally to methane. And on Monday, when we got here, that was the first thing I just happened to stumble upon was the methane connection. And they were having an interview with Governor John Bel Edwards of Louisiana, talking about methane. And he talked primarily about the impacts of climate change on the coastal waters of Louisiana with erosion, sea level rise, and all of the hurricanes. He talked a little bit about energy transition and how it's going to be very difficult for Louisiana, which is very fossil dependent, to transition away from that. The one thing he did not discuss whatsoever, and I spoke to him afterwards about that, were the health impacts, because methane emissions have a severe health impact, especially on communities of color and those who are living in close proximity to plants and wells that are emitting methane. So that kind of was a good start to the week, although it came 2 hours after I got in line to get into the venue because it has been a logistical nightmare this week. There are more people at COP than have been before, and it's a small venue. And while they had 2 years to prepare for it, they were not nearly as prepared as Madrid, which only had 1 month to prepare. So dealing with the methane issue, and then also, let's see. The notes that I have written to myself just say methane, 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 exclamation, exclamation, exclamation point. I've also had the opportunity to meet with a number of people in the faith community. Was interviewed by Stephen Hucklesby from the British Methodist Church, and which was quite interesting. And the problem for most of us is that there are too few, because of COVID, but also because of venue limitations, there are too few slots available for NGOs to attend sessions, attend any of the negotiations. And so that has been problematic throughout the week and continues to be a problem. For instance, Speaker Pelosi is coming in midweek, and only five NGO representatives are going to be permitted at that meeting, although I believe Beaman's one of them. Those are the kinds of issues. We have not had representation in the negotiations, which is very important for developing world nations. And so the access, the accessibility, all of these things have logistically very difficult to work through. A lot of times you want to attend one of the presentations and the room is maxed out. And so there's no place to go. And they're limiting seating, even on the floor around the perimeters of the room, no standing room only, those types of things. So that's probably the primary way it's been different from Madrid and past COPs is the accessibility issue.
Right. So, and Rev definitely talked about that on last week's episode too, that there were sometimes people were waiting in line watching the meeting from their phone, like we would be watching them from home here in the United States. So that said, there are opportunities. In fact, for the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be spending all of my time back and watching the sessions that I missed. Yeah, so just for our listeners to know that there are opportunities for you to watch and participate, just like folks who are waiting in line at the facility. So I'm going to ask the next question of Beaman. And before we started recording today, we talked about the idea that Mel is about to be heading home. And Beaman, you just recently showed up in Glasgow. So my understanding is this is your first COP. I'm curious what your initial impressions are, what you've been doing to get ready, and anything that you're particularly looking forward to.
Yeah, I'm about 10 hours into my experience so far. It's pretty interesting. It's funny because I've gotten a lot of very detailed descriptions of this over the years from my Texas Impact brethren, and I am here as B probably for the specific reason that this COP is talking a lot about loss and damage, which is an intersection of financing and wealthier countries and less wealthy countries, and the real impacts of global warming. They've always been real, but they're starting to manifest themselves in things that are measurable in dollars and cents all over the world now. I'm finding it to be quite interesting, Scott, to be honest with you, because this is an interesting intersection of people with a lot of different interests that are like standing around looking into a room, and they're all looking through different windows, but they're all looking at the same thing, which is climate change is bad, and we need to do something about it. Some of them are looking at it from the standpoint of monetary loss. Some of them are looking at it from the standpoint of national security. Some of them are looking at it from the standpoint of social justice and humanitarian issues. But interestingly, everybody is looking at the same causation of the thing that's giving them angst, and that's like potentially really healthy if we can get past sort of parochial solutions and get to the sort of root of the problem in our conversation.
All right, and we did also talk about loss and damage last week, and so we'll see if we have some follow-ups on that today. Isa, I'm going to turn to you next as the youngest member of our delegation. I did promise I won't name who the oldest member of the delegation is, so we'll just be ageist in that way. So this is your first time. You're going to be staying for the entirety of the conference. And I'm wondering, specifically as a young person, what are your observations so far? What outcomes do you think youth delegates are hoping for at the COP?
Yeah, it's very exciting to be at just a conference of this size in general and to see people my age and even younger that are, kids, that are just extremely informed and engaged. Last week I went to a Youngo panel, which is the UN's youth constituency, and I wasn't able to attend due to some accessibility, but I was able to catch it live kind of right next to the door. And just the way that they were so informed and so passionate about it that you don't see on many scales, because they were leading the conference themselves. They had some older adult panelists, but they were in charge of the events. They were hosting it and seeing it, everything, and just seeing how knowledgeable that they are at such a young age, and that they're not holding back on asking for demands. That event specifically, they had a whole list of what they wanted on climate change, finance. Every little intersection that they had, they were touching upon it. And their issues and their desires don't really differ from older delegates or older government agencies. They just are tired of not taking any more BS, and they're just demanding that change happen, because it's their future that they have to live in, not the older generations, because they will long be gone before the most detrimental effects soon arrive. So it's just really impressive to see people of such young age being this impactful this early on.
Thanks, Issa. And I'll note for our listeners, I will note that it wasn't me who called the young delegates kids. That was Issa. So if you have complaints about that, you can definitely email her and not me. So speaking of young delegates, Ilka, you've been going to these for what seems like forever. I don't know how you feel about not being the youngest one on the Texas Impact delegation this time, but we'll address that later. So you have been on several of these. You and B are staples. So one of the issues that you focus on and have been thinking about for years has been this intersection between climate policy, human rights, and migration. So what are your thoughts there, and are you hopeful that this COP can make progress on that issue?
I think it's complicated, but we remain hopeful. As you said, coming from El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, from the border community, and working with the migrants that we have received through the past years, especially a lot of them coming from Guatemala and indigenous communities, or communities that have been affected by very severe droughts connected to climate change, have been displaced not only because of the severe droughts, but also connected factors like increased violence, social instability that of course that causes. I understand that that's an important issue, right? And so come here, it's actually my first day too, just arriving and catch up and brush up on reports and going to meetings and trying to sense a little bit where we're standing on this issue that is important for me and the community that I'm coming to represent. It's a little unsettling. In some ways, I see a lot of progress being made. I think the conversation, people are really trying to push the conversation forward. Some of the connections had already been established, of course. I was reading on the task force report on displacement, and it was highlighting how a lot of more of the countries are starting to use a little bit of language on migration or human mobility on some sort of another in their national legal documents on climate change, a few of them, or different policies that connect climate and migration. But of course, we still need to push for more of those connections to happen, and more importantly, for the financing part, which is the most lacking part that is really happening, right? And so we remain hopeful in the sense that I think a lot of people are really trying to push it, but then we also see, actions like, unfortunately, the U.S. pulling back on some of the language on human rights and issues like that are very important. I think coming back, the idea of Biden in the speech that he gave, I think it galvanized all of us, and I think it really raised our hopes that the U.S. were going to start leading the conversation on human rights, on climate, and really take a progressive approach. But then we're hearing other stories too where we're not doing so good. And so I think it's a call for us to keep pushing harder, definitely, not to take it for granted that it's just going to happen.
Well, I do appreciate that the four of you are there on the ground helping make that push on behalf of the faith community here in the United States. And we'll look forward to continuing the conversation today and in the weeks to come. But for now, B, I'm going to bring you into the conversation because I know that you're not there in person. I see you're sitting in Josh's office right now. But you have been watching this kind of nonstop since it started after our conversation last Monday on Weekly Witness. So what are you seeing so far, and what questions do you have for the Texas Impact crew that's there on the ground now that we have them all in one place?
So I guess the first of all, I'm so glad you guys are there, and I wish I could be. And but I will say that because the access issues seem to be so extreme, and I mean, having said that, there are access issues with every COP because everyone always would like to be able to be, as we say, in the room where it happens, and it's often not possible for everybody to get there. But it does seem to be that this year, and maybe it's partly because COVID has kind of taught us all new ways of working, but a lot of it seems like it's going on online, not just as an ancillary for if you happen to not be able to get in the room, but that there are big portions of it that seem like they're specifically intended to be online. I watched the big displacement piece on Sunday, and it was on YouTube, and there were people from all over the world participating in the conversation all at one time. I'm wondering, I guess, particularly Mel and Ilka, since you've been there before, are you noticing any sense that the in-person meetings that people are having seem less critical because so much of the interaction is taking place online?
Go ahead, Ilka. Ilka just got here, so I guess that would be up to me. I do see a lot less interaction because the connectivity between various constituencies is really been a problem. It's especially been a problem with the faith community. We have not really been able to meet as a group as we have done in the past. And those in-person meetings have been severely limited. The one thing I would go back and say about Article 6 and loss and damage is that in the U.S.-CAN meeting on Thursday, the U.S. negotiators used the term loss and damage for the very first time. I think that's very significant. And so if the U.S. negotiators are using that terminology and that language, then perhaps we're going forward. I've also heard that they're anticipating not finishing by Friday as well, which was the case in Madrid as well. And so these things do tend to drag out. I think the limited number of people in the room, and especially the lack of representation in the negotiation from developing world countries, has been very much a hindrance to those negotiations. I think, these are things we have to work through. And there have been many pronouncements by the US government, by other governments, but words have to be put into action. And that's where everybody that's listening today needs to make their voices heard so that the words which are said are acted upon.
Isa, I have a question for you. So you were in one space where there were a lot of people in person. That was this weekend at the Global Climate Action. And I guess, I don't know, maybe everybody was there. I guess you weren't because you didn't get there yet. But Isa, talk about that experience of being in that giant protest.
Yeah, I've never been to any protest that size. I've been to much smaller ones. And what's cool about it is that they had individual blocks where you could join in and who you felt connected to. They had a climate justice block. They had specific blocks for different interests. They had a specific indigenous block, which I thought was really awesome because they made sure that it was at the front of the protest. And so they were kind of leading the voices and making sure that they were specifically heard. And one of the cool things I got from a white person's perspective was that they weren't allowing people to invade their spaces, and they had specifically set off that no, don't encroach on their space, make sure their block stays to their block, they keep it represented, and they had really empowering chants. It sounds a little cheesy, but at one point I got a little emotional just because it was so many people that cared about similar things that I did, and being from Texas, sometimes climate change can be put on the back burner. So seeing that all these people are actively engaged in a physical form of activism was really inspiring. Especially since COVID happened, I didn't know if too many or a lot of people, and then the weather was really bad, but there was massive amounts of people. And a lot of people wearing masks too, which was really cool because a lot of people cared still about the precautions. But it was a very large march. It went on for pretty much a couple miles, and the crowds never faltered. It was always strong leadership, and everything was engaging. Even people that were on the sidelines would jump in for a couple blocks to walk down. So it was just really cool to see people connected that weren't maybe have the access to get into these spaces such as COP, or didn't get a ticket to the green zone, but they still had ability to be active, especially in large protests. They did have that youth one the day before as well, so you could also go to both, or I know a lot of people were going to different blocks of what they wanted, but it was just great that there was opportunities outside of a convention that sometimes can be a little bit isolated. So it was really great to see that.
So Ilka, you've been for the past couple of years now in Europe. I mean, you've been in Geneva studying. It's an interesting perspective to come to the COP part of the US faith delegation, flying from your home in Switzerland instead of your home in El Paso. So do you get any different, how does it feel to see the United States maybe a little bit differently in this global arena now that you're able to look at it both from the inside and the outside? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely interesting. I mean, I've tried to stay connected, obviously, with the issues going on at home, and try to catch up with the news and see how the community is going. But yeah, I think we disappointed a lot of people in the previous COPs. So I think there's a lot of I think the eyes are on the US for sure on what we're gonna do about climate change. I think a lot of people were very excited that Obama was here and watching his speech, and when he was pushing for more ambition, and that we really need to do more. And yeah, it's just very interesting that I think people, really are hopeful that the U.S. is going to take leadership now that we have this new administration, and there seems to be a lot more energy. So I think a lot of eyes are on us for sure, and I think for the most part people seem to be hopeful now that the U.S. is actually going to take the leadership. I don't know, there might be some people that are also more skeptical about it, but for the most part, I think, at least coming from Geneva, I think people are really expecting the U.S. to take on more action.
I think people are very interested. They're glad that the U.S. is there. They're glad that we're back, but they are really looking to the U.S. to be very active and to take a forceful role in combating climate change. I think the governmental representatives from the U.S. are from a much higher level than they have been the past few years. They're people who can make a difference in policy decisions, whereas certainly in Madrid, they weren't the people to do that.
So, I mean, a couple of things I want to say about that. One, I want to ask Beaman a question, and I also want to flag a little bit of thing, Mel, that you said. and they're related. Beaman, I think the question that I wanted to ask you is, I mean, you're someone who has, as you say, you're entering your 11th hour of being at your first COP, but you have a lot of experience going to spaces where high stakes negotiations are happening. And similarly, you've had the experience in your career of having the interactions online and offline, and being in this space where there's, the long, slow conversation with the research, which is of course the hallmark of the UNFCCC, and then the periodic opportunities to go in the space where the high stakes negotiations are going to happen. And I also want to, Mel, when you say the people who were in Madrid were not the people who could deliver for the United States, a thing I do want to point out, though, is that they were there, that they were there, and they were career climate negotiators, even though the administration was not necessarily favorable. So, Beaman, given those two ideas, can you comment on kind of the why does it matter for everybody to get together in person, and what should we expect out of the specific actors who happen to show up in the room versus the broader process that goes on all the time domestically?
Well, I think public policy follows Newton's first law, which is that to paraphrase it, policy in motion tends to stay in motion, and policy at rest tends to stay at rest. And our peculiar politics with the United States, if we literally just stopped and turned everything around and went the other direction, it would be disastrous for our ability to actually have policy that's based on research, that's based on what I think of as a rational trajectory. So I get exactly what Mel is saying, right? When he says it's a frustrating thing when we have so much to say, we have so much wealth to deploy, we have so much influence, and there's an inhibition to that deployment. Yeah, I get that, but at the same time, I get what you're saying, B, which is that the maintenance of that continuity, so that it's like when you push the clutch in your car, don't hit the brakes. Just coast for a little while and then get back to it. For those of you who still drive a Standard like I do, but I think that sense of continuity is really important, and I think it's especially important because of the factual development of climate change. And B, you and I have talked about this a lot. Climate change used to be the province of the intelligentsia, right? There were some people with theories saying, hey, we're seeing all of these different sort of statistical anomalies, and it turns out they're not anomalies. They're these things that are tied together. You tell me, but 20 years ago, that's kind of what climate change was. There were scientists who knew about it in the 70s or had positing theories about it. But even fairly recently, there's a notion that climate change belonged in some sort of like academic salon. And that is just not the case anymore. It is as real can be, and it's real to everybody. Now people are saying, how can I protect these small pieces of things that are important to me? How can I recognize climate change but preserve a relationship with fossil fuel if that's a strong relationship I have? Or how can I recognize climate change but be careful about human rights related to climate change? For the record, I don't agree with either one of those positions, but now you're looking at people trying to preserve these sort of discrete spaces of interest rather than trying not to engage the issue as a whole, because it's real, it's here. And if I may say one more thing about it, and this is sort of an interesting thing, I think the global economic forecasts related to temperature rise, and B, you and I talk about this a lot and trade a lot of literature about it, are getting to be so serious. You're talking about the loss of 15 to 18% of the world's GDP in 30 years. And that's a mega catastrophe in the face of rising population. And I think that we know better than we have ever known the fragility of things like the global supply chain. And if you kind of overlay those two things and say we've got this freight train of economic loss bearing down on us, and we are really sensitive to what that can mean in countries that aren't just our country. It's real. And so I think that the continuity of these talks is vital, because what they mean is that now that this sort of the lights are all coming on, we have a trajectory, we're moving, and we're not just trying to invent something out of nothing.
So I think that is some really heavy stuff, and probably anybody who was listening to it would want to take a second to just kind of digest it all and say that number one more time that you said. What percent of GDP is at risk?
If we continue on our current trajectory, of increase, it would be about 18% of the world's GDP. If we are able to get down into sort of the current negotiation space above 1.5, it would be about 15%. If we can get all the way down to 1.5 degrees warming over time, then it gets down around the 10% range. We're still going to suffer an economic loss, no doubt about it. I think the other thing to recognize that's important, and it's important in the loss and damage conversation, is that the middle projection for the United States is 7%, because we're quite resilient and we have a big cushion for being able to adapt. We are adaptive, and our adaptive index is very high. Other countries would still be losing double-digit GDP. Most of the rest of the world would lose in excess of 14 to 15% of their GDP, even on a moderate warming trajectory. So this is serious. It's serious for us as a country. It's double serious globally, and we need to stand up and say it.
Well, and one of the things that immediately raises, and Ilka, I'm curious how much you all in your master's program have talked about this too, is the potential for global conflict. That if some people are losing a lot and some people are not losing as much, the people who are losing a lot probably typically notice that things are not even, that the risk is not evenly distributed. Is there some portion of the COP that becomes basically global security negotiations, not just science? I don't mean in the future. I mean, can we interpret it to be that way, that it is actually helping us prevent wars, not just helping us prevent floods?
I know from the report that there's countries that do connect climate with issues of security in their national legislation. However, in the more international framework, it hasn't come out as strongly, at least. But it's definitely a concern, I would say, because there's so many connected factors to even what we think like slow climate change being a slow change. In some places more than in others, the social impacts of it are very strong, and it's a catalyst for a lot of social instability, unfortunately.
Yeah, B, if I may say, one United States institution that is making that connection very starkly is the United States Army. And they have issued a series of climate reports, and a very comprehensive one recently, that fundamentally ties the allocation of resources and security concerns to climate change and to temperature rise. And so, again, unignorable, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
B, I would also say that one of the things that has been missing has been the strong moral voice of the faith community. It's been pretty much neglected at this COP. It hasn't been incorporated, and people of faith need to speak out. We were told that by the Speaker of the House in Madrid. The same thing needs to be said. The faith community needs to take the moral lead on this issue.
So I kind of want to ask you guys a little bit of a lighter question, just real quick. And I guess that would be something, one of the things, I mean, Ilka, you and I've definitely had this conversation before. One of the things about being at the COP is the sense of kind of being at the crossroads of the world, that you're in, there are people walking by in, I don't know, has anybody so far seen the guy dressed as Father Christmas or one of the guys dressed in penguin suit? You got to see him, okay. Yeah. But also see people in their indigenous outfits and people, you know, very serious business looking people and hippies for sure. And we see displays of all different faith traditions and kind of curiosities. One of the things I was able to do in Madrid, remember, is learn to spin at the kind of spinning wheel that Gandhi used in India. I'm wondering so far what you guys have seen, and apologies, Beaman and Ilka, you haven't had very long to see it, but already, is there anything that you've seen that's kind of struck you as, Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore, we're at the COP? Issa, what about you? You've gotten to see a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I think coming from Texas and being isolated to solely my experiences in San Antonio and Austin, it's very different. I've never been in a large international space where around me we have French, German, Swedish, we have every language you could think of. One of the things that was interesting to me is that the pavilions are really interesting in that aspect where you have different little pods of cultures that you could just easily access by just walking forward or backwards. For example, there's a Japan pavilion, and if you go a little bit further, you have Australia, and then you cross down, and then there's a Brazilian pavilion. And what's really fun to me is just listening in, and you hear Japanese and English and then just straight Brazilian for a couple of miles. And it's just not an experience you get outside of anywhere. And regardless of the political intensity that these negotiations are in such high spirits, people are just engaging on an interesting level and just talking. Sometimes there's this little pavilion that has an open interfaith dialogue. Sometimes Susan Hendershot was there, and I've been at a couple of them, and you have people in different pastor garbs from different areas and different faiths, and they all come together, sit down. And I think that's really interesting to me because I haven't seen people of Buddhism, Hinduism, and any different, just sitting around a little table and just talking, not necessarily about climate change or politics, but just talking about faith and what brings together. And I think just having that accessibility to that is something that is extremely unique to COP.
I think also from my perspective, in my experiences in Africa, meeting with African delegates and seeing their real sense of despair almost because of the increasing drought that is taking over the continent and the impacts of climate on them, and that's continent wide. And but I get hope when I see the people who on the ground are doing reforestation, they're drilling for water, they're making positive steps to overcome a lot of the problems that are not coming from their continent, they're coming from the rest of the world.
Yeah, I guess a question for all four of you would be, do you feel you have any sense of unease or guilt about the role the United States plays in the global stage? And do you have any sense of you're there, COP, without doubt, you are there with people whose lives and the lives of people they love are much more at hazard than ours are?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, I was at a thing afterwards, up talking to the panel, and we were talking about floods and flood rate. It was all about one of the issues was the issue of early warning, right? And the fact that climate change has wrought this increase in natural disasters, which has led to an increase in death and loss and all manner of calamities. And the subject matter being discussed was a standardization of warnings. So basically saying, if you're gonna, don't talk about the weather as what it is, talk about it as what it does. So that when instead of saying the wind's going to blow 60 knots, saying the wind is going to be blowing strongly enough to knock down trees. It seems like a simple thing, right? And we have an amazing array of instrumentation and government and non-government and for-profit people who are dying to tell us how bad the weather's going to be. And you know, we all know Jim Cantore leaning into the wind and giving us the business, right? It was really an interesting thing for me to listen to that presentation and then talk to the people afterwards and hear them say in no uncertain terms, when they asked me where I was from, and I said where I was from, and I said, yeah, you know, what you were saying really makes sense to me. And before I even said anything else, they said, yeah, we need solutions like some of this. We've been working with stuff that you all have, but in parallel to it, not actually with it, because what you have is not affordable for the rest of the world. So there's one group that's testing out water gauges or flood gauges in parallel to the U.S. Geological Survey flood gauges that I look at all the time in Texas, because I like to know when I need to go paddle my kayak. And but they're saying the solution is not to put USGS gauges all over the place to help people survive floods, because nobody can afford what you guys have. We need to. You're like a test constant, not an actual solution. And I found that to actually be quite humbling.
Yeah.
To say that there's this idea that we have a bunch to offer and we're not going to give it to people. And what they're really saying is, really, you don't even have stuff to offer, and your solutions are not scalable solutions.
Wow.
And I found that to be really an interesting moment for me.
Is that kind of like we're the laboratory that develops these, and then eventually the cost comes down and makes them available to everyone else?
Or just we've been so spoiled to not having to have the crushing of, can we really afford this great thing? We just have the great things. And so it's so yeah, I mean, I think there's some value, Mel, in that in being able to come up with alternatives that do the same thing. But it's I don't know, you see it as you know, Mel, you see it in the mission field all the time. When you go to Mexico and build a house with a shovel, and somebody invariably says, well, why don't we get a cement mixer down here? And you say, because we don't have cement mixers down here. And so it's, you know, it's that thing.
I've mixed cement on the ground.
Ilka, I'd like to hear your comment on Beaman's perspective there.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there's two things that the U.S. can do very well: is give money and get out of the way. Yeah, I mean, like, there's a lot of spaces that sure our solutions might not work, but we still have, as you say, a lot of resources. And I think, you know, the conversation about financing, I think we should be more courageous, because we can't afford to even give the money away, you know, because we can't. Thankfully, you know, it's not to homogenize the United States, because there are communities that obviously also are more climate vulnerable and will need resources, and we're not taking care of our own people. So it's important to highlight that. But I think it is important that the U.S. has more ambition and what to put into the table. And as I said, get out of the conversation when it's actually taking down things like human rights and or stopping the conversation with other countries want to be correct.
the equalization of finance is a very important issue.
Lisa, you just graduated with a degree in sustainability. I'm wondering if you're seeing things that are piquing your interest at the COP, if you're seeing things that are making you think, oh, I learned about it in school, or I didn't learn about it in school, but things that are making you excited for the future of sustainability in a kind of technical policy sense.
Yeah, a lot of it is like many of the terms that I studied, whether in college or just working in environmental, they come up many a times in different press conferences or engaging in different conversations with individuals. I think I've touched a lot in my studies on international politics sometimes, and global governance being one of the things that you read about because you don't have access to actually go experience anything internationally. And so just seeing open dialogues on how interconnected governmental bodies can actually achieve something is very different than reading a book about it and how they describe it as complex and it's difficult, but then actually seeing how complex and difficult it is another thing, because you realize how much more of a tedious task it is because everybody has their own perspective or their own desires, and a lot of times the goals don't line up even when they need to line up. And so I think having more of an interest in this just big international space is something that's catching my eye the most, because this is a level I've never been at. And also just seeing how when I listened to a panel from Canada International that's talked about energy justice, I actually spoke with, I mentioned to you the lady Jean Sue from the Center for Diversity, and she was talking about this energy justice program, and I've been able to do a lot of work with the PUC on energy policy. And so that was one of the areas that I got really excited about, because she just described exactly the intersections of climate change, public health, and physical work that they're doing on a broader scale. And so I think just seeing how work locally can go up to federally to international is just mind-blowing for someone so young in my career.
Man, and such music to Beaman and Mel's in my ears, right? To hear you say that. Well, Scott, I bet you want me to turn it back over to you. Thanks for letting me horn in and ask so many questions, but I'll turn it back to fearless leader now, Scott, to bring it on home.
Yeah, before we close out though, and thanks B for guiding that conversation. I know there are a lot of people who are listening who will be looking for resources or ways that they can follow along with what's happening. I just wonder if y'all have any suggestions about either resources they should be keying into or things that you'd recommend them watching over the course of the closing days of the conference. So I'll just open it up to any of y'all. Any thoughts for our listeners?
Well,
Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
Go ahead, Beaman.
The COP26,
Yeah.
the UN stuff itself is actually quite good. It has different perspectives, and it doesn't necessarily get into the girders and wiring of the negotiations, but it definitely has the UN materials have a commitment to the diverse viewpoints and the diverse expressions of everybody. So I'd strongly recommend that. I find it quite interesting.
And I would also suggest U.S. Climate Action Network, U.S. CAN. Resources are more specific to U.S. and our constituencies.
Yeah, and I think I'd say one last thing that I always forget to mention, but for our listeners who will have heard us refer to the Quorum Report and the Texas Tribune as the kind of inside baseball publications that you could follow for kind of perspectives on what's going on at the Texas Capitol, I would say that if you go to the Climate Action Network and also the Climate Home News, which is a publication that comes out of Great Britain, both of those would be, in my view, the Quorum Report and the Texas Tribune, respectively, of the COP. They're the You won't learn everything. You'll learn the stuff that the insiders are going to think is the most important to keep up with.
B, also, if people are interested, there are so many resources here that are on YouTube that anybody can access.
Yep.
And that's going to be a very important source. And you can look at the COP26 schedule and find a lot of those things and then go to them on YouTube.
Absolutely.
I appreciate that. And I do want to give our young voices one more chance to weigh in before we close out. So Isa and then Ilka, anything that you think people should be watching over the course of the next the next week?
I think tomorrow is a really interesting day. They focus on gender and the intersection in climate change, which I think sometimes is an area that people overlook a lot. They don't think that climate affects different populations and genders differently, and it's actually drastically differently, especially in roles of livelihood and how women's responsibilities and men's responsibilities get separated multiple times, and how that directly is impacted from climate change. So I think if you are able to check on the COP26 website and catch any of the live events that are interested to you, I think it's a great way to keep engaging in an area that sometimes I think is overlooked, especially on a gender spectrum. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind, especially because it is tomorrow.
And I would like to follow up because we're actually just together on an event that focused on gender and climate solutions, and it was regarding non-technical solutions. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for not only creating, carbon, like very techy things that are gonna suck the carbon out of the air, but we have to realize that there's also non-technical solutions and a lot that people could be doing. So I think looking out for ways of being creative and engaging even in our own ways, in our own communities, and how to tackle the climate question. And I think it's an invitation for all of us to be creative and explore the possibilities in our communities.
Scott, I know that Beaman and I are not the young people, but one thing I would also suggest is that each day of COP has a separate focus, and tomorrow is gender. There have been loss and damage, and every day has its own focus. Friday was the youth focus. And so if people are interested, they can go to the COP website and find out what the focus for that day was or is going to be, and then hone in on those.
I appreciate it. And Mel, I think you are young at heart, so I will always count you.
I think I'm older than Beaman.
Well, we won't get onto that on air. I'll let y'all settle that, around the living room or something. Hey, y'all, thank you so much for taking the time. I know these are really long days and you're doing incredible work. So thank you for taking the time. And thank you so much for representing the faith voices back at home and doing this work. Y'all are all amazing, incredible advocates, and we're so grateful to have you representing all of us there. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And friends, thank y'all for tuning in today. If you've stayed with us this long, I hope that you've enjoyed the content, and you'll take just a moment to leave us a rating or review in whatever source you use to access this content, and make sure you share it with a friend. Give us the highest rating, share it with a friend, share it with your congregation so even more people can take advantage of this content. And remember to keep an eye on Texas Impact social media for upcoming announcements and events. I know we have a couple coming up soon. So keep an eye on texasimpact.org and social media for those announcements, or you can always email me at scott@texasimpact.org with questions or for more information. And remember, if you support Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, please make sure that you and your congregation are members by going to texasimpact.org/join. Friends, these are unprecedented times, both here in Texas and throughout the world, and the world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. Let's get to work.